Thank you for joining us today. This is our last event in our Short and Sweet Your Next Conference series. Today, we're going to be talking about abstracts for conferences. So this is sort of the first thing you need as you apply to present your poster or your presentation at a conference. So today we're joined by Rachel Lundwall. She is from the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. And she's here to talk about abstracts. And like I said, there's a workshop there's a worksheet she's going to take you through. So just check your email for that reminder that you got in the last couple of days. It should be there. Otherwise, I'm seeing comments already for me to send it to your email. You can shoot me an email and I will get it to you as well. So a little bit about Rachel. She has a master's degree in writing, rhetoric, and literacy from the, I wanted to say the University of Arizona, because that's where I'm from, but she did this at Arizona State University. And over the past 13 years, she's worked as a writing teacher, editor, proposal manager, and grant writer. And she joined the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health in 2021, and she sits as a research writing support. And a fun fact she wanted to share was that she lived in Texas for 30 years and she really misses their food, which I understand. Food in Texas is pretty good the few times I've been there. So I can imagine comparing it to the food here in Madison. It's kind of sad. But thanks for joining us, everybody. Again, get your worksheets ready.
As Jen mentioned, this is the last session about conference abstracts. We'll skim over the lamer meme that I had on my opening slide. Not as funny, but hopefully the jokes get better. So the objectives for today's presentation are primarily the first two: understand what makes a strong conference abstract and break down a process for writing a strong abstract. And that is what the worksheet is for. You do not need to work through it while I'm talking. You know, if we can send it out in the email with the materials afterwards, if that's preferable. But it will just present the information that I'm taking you through today in a different way, in a way that you can actually like fill in the information that you need to as you're working on your own abstracts, if you prefer. If we have time, we will compare a weak versus stronger abstract, but I don't anticipate we will have time. Okay, so first, what makes a strong abstract? I'm going to have to minimize faces so that I can see my own slides. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the purposes of an abstract are to encapsulate and raise interest in your presentation content so that conference organizers and participants can make informed decisions about what presentations to include or attend. And so knowing that you have this dual audience of organizers and potential audience members for the presentation itself should inform what you write, and then also that you're summarizing and trying to draw interest in your content. These are all the things that you need to accomplish with an abstract. And so the characteristics of a strong abstract are one, that it's concise, typically about 200, 250 words, specific, and that's what the spoiler alert is for. You don't want to hold back anything significant from the abstract. It should all be in there. All the spoilers should be in there. Timely or relevant. This should be about something that people will want to learn about. And then, of course, compliant with conference requirements, including the conference mission, theme, etc. There we go. Okay, since one of the main characteristics of abstracts is that it is concise, here are some tips for concise writing. We have first choosing strong verbs. And I put a note specifically to watch out for nominalization. So things that could be verbs, but we turned into nouns by adding endings like THION, MENT. So for example, we came to the conclusion, we concluded. We conducted a survey versus we surveyed, or we made an adjustment versus we adjusted. And we tend to see the first half of those examples frequently in academic writing. And while it's great to train ourselves out of that habit, it's especially handy in an abstract when words count. You really want to save those words for talking about like important details of your research and not fluffing it out at all with anything that's unnecessary. Simplifying phrasing like utilize versus use in order to just say to, or as well as versus and, just as quick and simple as you can get, especially for like these words aren't going to be, they're not informative, right? They're just there to lead to the main idea. And so anything that isn't essential, make it short and to the point. And then default to active voice. So samples were tested by the team would be an example of passive writing, when you could just say we tested samples, or in this second example, quarterly meetings were held with community partners. The study team met with community partners quarterly. And for that last example, it's not necessarily any shorter than saying the sentence in a passive way, but it does help the reader understand what's happening more quickly because of how English grammar is set up, is that we start with the person or thing that's doing the action. So it's typically going to be more efficient to start that way. You have to do less explaining afterwards if you just use active voice by default. And then, of course, in this day and age, I can also encourage you for a tip for concise writing is to use AI tools as needed. And you don't even have to go very far. Even as I was just typing out my examples, right? Microsoft PowerPoint underlines and told me like that I was being too wordy and told me just use concluded. And so if you just pay attention to what writing, whatever writing or like program that you're creating for your content, those tools are pretty ubiquitous now. So just see what's highlighted and see if those tips are worth considering, because it may save you some time and work. Okay, and continuing on with the being concise, we've got finally using precise language and concrete details. And the details is where you do actually want to spend more time, right? So the point of being concise in other areas is so that you have maximized the room that you have to talk about the specifics of your presentation, whether that's a research project, quality improvement project, or some other sort of presentation that you will have. So you want to watch out for cliches, buzzwords, and like preambles, which I'll give an example of in a minute, and instead replace those with specifics to your project, so that you're just focused and staying on target on what makes your project unique, instead of describing it as unique. So for example, instead of saying we used state-of-the-art technology to analyze these images, you could just say we analyzed these images with whatever that technology was, which allowed us to blank. And then if you're providing that explanation of what it's allowing you to do that's different, that's creating more understanding, and still conveys the message of state-of-the-art without sounding cliche. In the second example, our study employed a novel approach. Instead, just describe what was unique about it and then what that made possible for the first time. You don't need to label it as novel if you can just say what makes it novel, because that's what people will be interested in anyway. And the third example is the example of the preamble, which I see quite frequently actually, where we have some sort of broad general statement such as we employed a range of qualitative methods in our study, specifically we blank. And you can just completely skip that part and just say we conducted focus groups and one-on-one interviews, and just cutting to the chase saves you a lot of space when it matters in an abstract. And for our next tip, writing for that dual audience, there's both the presenter or the conference organizers and the potential audiences, but also recognizing that your audience will, for a conference, may not be your typical audience that you're used to writing for. So whoever will be attending the conference and what the theme and goals of that conference are will influence what terminology is appropriate to use in your abstract and the best way to begin and conclude that abstract. So the example that I have here is, say I've been working on a project where what I want to share in my presentation is how to recognize language female patients might use to describe mental distress as a potential sign of autism spectrum disorder. But if I want to present this same content at 2 different conferences, then how I'm going to write my abstract will be different for each of those. So in the left column, we have a conference for autism researchers and specialists. So that's a very field-focused conference. And then on the right, primary care providers and researchers. And understanding that they have different goals will determine the best way to communicate with them. So in the left column, the autism researchers and specialists will be interested in increasing understanding of the spectrum of autism and understanding what symptoms manifest across different demographics and how to detect them and intervene earlier. Whereas primary care providers or researchers have a more broad interest in improving health outcomes and delivering preventative care for the best outcomes for their patients across a wide array of potential health issues. So this is going to impact, one, obviously the baseline knowledge that these different audiences have about the topic, and also the best way to communicate with them. So in this example, on the left with the autism conference, you would want to focus on the knowledge gaps the research fills, practical applications, remaining questions, and next steps, really focusing on the contribution to the field. Whereas on the right-hand column with primary care providers in that conference, you would need to start by describing the poor outcomes of undetected autism spectrum disorder, because you need to establish a shared baseline of knowledge before you can get into your study. And then you would focus after that on how preventing these outcomes and improving patients' lives is possible by recognizing language from female patients that might signal ASD. Okay, so those were our general tips on what makes a strong abstract. And now we're going to just break this down into a process. Again, the worksheet that is paired with this presentation is something that will walk you through this process as well in a different format. So you do not need to feel obligated to look at it while I'm going through these slides. Okay, so your first step is always to check the guidelines. Including reading the mission and theme of the conference. Make sure that your topic is a good fit for that conference. And then save or make a checklist of the presenter instructions. Some conferences provide them for you, some of them do not, so you can make your own. So including required sections and how they label them. Sometimes someone will say background, sometimes it'll be introduction, sometimes purpose is combined with background, etc. So how they have it broken down and any additional instructions such as word limit, formatting, etc. If you can, it would be also great if you can find examples of abstracts that did get presentations at past conferences for that conference organizer. So ideally from the same organizers and a similar presentation type. Again, like if you're presenting on a research project, or if you are, say, pitching a discussion panel for your presentation at the conference, like if you could see an example of a successful abstract, that would be awesome. If you can't, that's fine too. Okay, so your second step, after you have your list for what your abstract needs to include or not include, then you need to establish the context or need for your presentation. So this will be addressing the questions like, what is the problem or gap I want to address? who is affected by this gap or problem and how are they affected, and why do we need to address that problem or gap now? There may have been a recent event that made the problem more urgent, or maybe recent developments in the field have made a solution more likely. Whatever that might be, these are things to consider while you're establishing that context and need. But probably the point in here that I would try to always include would be, what will addressing the problem or gap make possible? So that's solution-oriented thinking, like, why do we need to talk about this? So this will become, if you're just like bullet pointing out answers to some of these questions, you should have enough content for your background section of approximately 2 sentences. Everything is approximate in this presentation because obviously word limits vary from conference to conference, and also, as I mentioned earlier, the amount of work you need to put in the background may vary based on your audience. Maybe you need to spend some time establishing a shared baseline knowledge. So about 2 sentences, give or take. Okay, your next step will be to define your objectives or objective. So if you are reporting projects, quality improvement, or research, you would just say, this study aimed to blank, and you would choose, again, a strong verb and then some sort of measurable goal. For other presentations, such as workshops, discussion panels, you might say, on completion of this session, participants will be able to blank. This purpose statement will usually be, about 1 sentence. If you had, and you probably did have, multiple aims for a study, probably anticipate needing to summarize those into 1 sentence for the abstract because of word count. Okay, and we're going to spend some time talking more about strong verbs and measurable outcomes. I'm starting with a reminder that no fishing is allowed. And what I mean by this is that your verbs do need to be strong and suggest measurable outcomes. So for example, consider, examine, explore, and study are vague, weak, fishing type of verbs, right? They don't imply any sort of concrete outcome. At what point can you measure that you've considered it enough, right? So that's not going to be a strong verb. Instead, I would suggest verbs such as these. This is not all-inclusive by any means, but we have an example of 2 categories of verbs. I have them divided into understand, or more like initial learning type objectives. So if you're trying to classify, identify, interpret, measure, and then a second section for more practical application of knowledge. So if the goal is to adapt or develop or model. So these are stronger, and they're easier to assign measurable outcomes and goals to those verbs. So as an example, I have 2 objective statements, one for more like project-based. This study aimed to determine whether a community-oriented primary care curriculum was associated with difference in residents' community engagement, population health attitudes, and career plans. But an objective statement for a different kind, more of a learning objective statement, might look like, on completion of the session, participants will be able to describe the 3 primary tenets of the patient self-efficacy model and outline a quality improvement project for their clinics. Okay, step 4 is to summarize your content for the presentation itself. The summary will be the longest section of the abstract and likely the final deciding factor on whether you are invited to present, right? This is where you need to provide enough detail so that people can figure out if your project is relevant to them, if you're using similar methods to what they're interested in, if you had any findings that they would be interested in, if the science was sound, et cetera. So you do need to provide enough detail that people can assess that for themselves. So I know it sounds contradictory, but you need to be both specific and concise. Concise with the fluffy words and specific with the things that matter. So details that you may need to include would be, what is the presentation or project type? Is this a workshop, a discussion panel, a survey study, etc.? Who is or was invited or involved? This could be your participants or study team, or for presentations, who are your presenters, and why would your intended audience want to hear from them specifically on this topic? Where and when did the project take place? That would obviously be if you're reporting on projects. How did or how will you achieve the project or presentation objectives? These are your methods. What did you do? How did you do it? And then finally, why did you do it, or why did you do it this way? Sometimes that's self-explanatory, but sometimes you do need to provide a rationale for those decisions. So this would be your method section if we're using more typical like research abstract terminology, and that would be roughly 5 sentences, at about 10 if you have a presentation of a different sort, like a discussion panel, for example. And the reason it's longer for those is because the projects also need to report out their results, and that's going to also take about 5 sentences. And it's just the facts. Remember, for results, we're just reporting the findings. So for example, any numbers and demographics of participants, your response or completion rate, and any results from your analysis, whether those are statistics, themes, etc. Okay, and then no matter your project type or presentation type, you will highlight the relevance of your presentation for this audience. So for research projects and QI projects, etc., you will be discussing, what do the findings reveal or suggest? What are the real world implications? And or what future research or action is needed? For other presentations, how does the presentation relate to the mission, theme, values, and or needs for the conference? And how will the presentation benefit or interest attendees and beyond? So this would be about 2 sentences. Your 6th step is the most fun. Sorry, I keep having to move my menu around. Okay, determining the title. You do have a little more leeway with abstract or presentation title for a conference than maybe you might feel you have for a publication. So it can be a little bit more fun, but at minimum, you need to include something that describes your project. So that might be the project or presentation type. So if you're having a workshop, that should be in the title, and any keywords or phrases that describe your project. It may help to see if you can describe your presentation in 1 sentence and then pare that down to roughly 15 words for a title length. So for example, the impact of a community-oriented primary care curriculum on residents' career plans, a survey study, tells you both the project type and some keywords that might draw people who are interested in those things. But you don't have to be boring. You can add a hook. I have some examples of some of these, in full disclosure, are actually publications and not presentations, but good examples of hooks. So we have a pun, leave me alone, visual constraints on the ecology of social group formation, an illusion. You probably think this paper is about you, narcissist perceptions of their personality and reputation. Idiom, hiding in plain sight, finding females with autism, and figurative language, or which can sometimes be a participant quote, or some people will just use a participant quote as the hook. Walking alone, patient experiences with substance use disorder. And one of the great things about adding the hook is that, remember that one of the purposes of the abstract is to raise interest. And, the motivations of people attending conference is obviously to learn more about their field. But, they might also be more drawn to a presentation that sounds interesting, and titles can be an effective way to do that. However, if you are not feeling bold or creative, you do not have to force it, because there's always a really safe and effective backup option, which is to either center your presentation topic. This works best if this is a hot or urgent topic. For example, the Latinx physicians shortage, thinking through solutions. That's a title from a presentation by a doctor in my department. And then highlighting a key finding. This also works best if the finding could change what people do. So for example, rapid detection of influenza in nursing homes reduces emergency department visits, also from someone in my department. And the great thing about these is that if you're presenting amongst colleagues in your field, they know what the hot and urgent topics of their field are. And if you're centering something that's important, then you don't need something flashy as a hook. They'll be like, oh, that's an important topic that I am interested in, and can, choose to attend your presentation that way. Or if, they're in the field and you can highlight a key finding, they will know it's a key finding that has potential implications for them, and is therefore just as effective as any other hook, if not more. Okay, and then the seventh step is to verify the compliance of your draft with the checklist that you made in step one. So I'll share a cautionary tale. I read this one study that found that 71.6% of rejected abstracts were rejected for readily correctable errors, specifically non-adherence to submission guidelines, prior to the consideration of scientific value. Now, this was an analysis done of abstracts accepted and rejected for just one conference. So how generalizable that is, I cannot say. However, I do find it very significant, and especially if you can see in this next slide what these reasons were for why abstracts were rejected. That the vast majority of them fell under fail to follow submission requirements for acronyms or abbreviations that were not spelled out or defined. That was most of them. Typographical, grammatical errors, identify information such as the facility, authors or researchers' names, etc. And then it gets smaller down the list. But these are all 100% preventable, and they should not be the reason that your abstract is rejected, right? Like, before they even considered the value and merit of the research or the presentation, it was rejected because of these completely preventable reasons. And so going through and checking, double checking, making sure that it's right, because it is in your control to prevent this unfortunate outcome. Let's do a quick, how are we doing on time? Okay. Oh, I'm breezing through this. Okay, we do have time to go through a sample abstract. Now, this was written with the help of Microsoft Copilot. Thank you, Jen Rims, for doing that. And then worsened further by me to make a point. So here we have this abstract, ineffectiveness of using books to treat ganglion cysts. And we can see in the introduction here, an old home remedy for treating ganglion cysts involves hitting them with a heavy object, such as a book. This method, often referred to as Bible therapy, is believed to burst the cyst and relieve symptoms. our study aimed to evaluate the effectiveness of hitting ganglion cysts with books. So one potential issue that I see already in this introduction is that, I mean, depending on what the conference is for, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that there's not a conference dedicated specifically to ganglion cysts. And so this introduction is lacking an opening statement to establish some sort of baseline shared knowledge for any potential attendees of this presentation. So it could use some more context and grounding on why this is important. Maybe even like how many patients are actually hitting their cysts with heavy objects, and the potential damage that might cause. Basically, you know, this doesn't really establish very well why this matters, or even how useful it will be to evaluate the effectiveness of hitting cysts with books. And granted, this is kind of comedic, right, as an example, but this introduction could do more work establishing why this is important. And we'll go ahead and compare that to, no, sorry, just kidding. Okay, so in the next section, we have a very brief, much too brief method section. To investigate the effectiveness of this method, a survey was conducted among 50 individuals who attempted to treat their ganglion cysts by hitting them with books. The results showed that 80% of participants experienced no improvement in their symptoms, while 60% reported increased pain and bruising. Additionally, 30% of participants developed complications such as infections or damage to surrounding tissues. In conclusion, hitting ganglion cysts with books is an ineffective and potentially harmful treatment. Individuals with ganglion cysts should seek proper medical advice and consider safer evidence-based treatment options. So study, like methodology, study design aside, which obviously might raise questions for some people, it's not detailed enough. It doesn't really tell us enough about their methods at all. They just say they surveyed 50 individuals. That's it. Nothing about where they were or how they found these 50 individuals, how they knew that they had attempted to pop their cysts with books, and no sort of detail about that. Nothing to suggest how strong or weak the study design was, anything like that. And then for the conclusion, it is self-evident. It's not giving us any information that will help us or like move the conversation forward at all. And in fact, ends with advice to patients instead of addressing the actual audience, which is presumably other scientists or medical professionals. And presumably they already know that patients should seek medical advice. So this isn't well written. It's not geared for the right audience, and it doesn't have the right impact. So we're going to compare this to a stronger, now it's not perfect because I was just editing a weak abstract, right? And I had to make up some facts to make it sound stronger. So please do not evaluate this based on scientific merit. But here's a stronger version of what that abstract could be. I'm starting with a much stronger title, Bible Therapy, in quotes, Patient Reported Outcomes of a Home Remedy for Ganglion Cysts. So already we have, we have a hook, which we could dispense with if we needed to. The important part really is that second part, that we're talking about patient-reported outcomes, and that we're obviously about the ganglion cyst, that's the central topic, and a home remedy for it. Okay, so our new introduction, ganglion cysts are non-cancerous lumps that commonly develop along the tendons or joints of the wrists or hands and can cause pain, tingling, or numbness if they press on nearby nerves. Okay, here we have this grounding sentence, so everyone now has a shared baseline of knowledge that we can then move forward to understand the context and importance of the rest of the study. An old home remedy for treating ganglion cysts involves hitting them with a heavy object, such as a book, which is believed to burst the cyst and relieve symptoms. However, this so-called Bible therapy has no basis in the literature and may be dangerous for patients. To better understand how physicians should discuss treatment options with patients, we aim to establish whether patients who report using this remedy deem it safe and effective. You can see in the things that we've added here, I've established a reason for the study, like what is the true objective. It's not just to figure out if this is a smart way to treat cysts. It's, okay, how do we figure out how to talk to patients who do use this method? What are their experiences with it? And we need this baseline knowledge in order to have an effective conversation. Okay, that's a much more credible reason for the study. And a much more compelling statement for the problem, right? That this is potentially harmful and dangerous and has no evidence base. And so we need to figure out how to communicate that there are better ways to patients to treat these cysts. So that introduction does a much better job. Now, the methods are still weak because I didn't have room to make them as long as they needed to be, but they're still better. So we started with, based on electronic health records of a Midwestern health system. So we've got a location here for our summary. We invited 200 patients diagnosed with ganglion cysts to participate in the survey. Among 75 respondents, 50 reported hitting their ganglion cysts with heavy objects within the last 5 years. These participants were asked where and when they learned about this treatment, how often they attempted it, and its outcomes. The majority of patients, 75%, heard about the remedy from a family member and only attempted it once, 55%, or twice, 33%. 80% of participants experienced no improvement in their symptoms, and 60% reported increased pain and bruising. Additionally, 30% of participants developed complications such as infections or damage to surrounding tissues. Once again, I want to emphasize, all of that is completely made up. So I just threw in numbers, but you can see what a stronger methods section sounds like, that we have go into much more detail about how this survey was designed, what we were trying to figure out, and what we did find. And then in our discussion conclusion section, which this method section, again, is too short. It needs to discuss a little bit more what the findings were in the meeting. But in conclusion, hitting ganglion cysts with heavy objects is ineffective at relieving symptoms and highly likely to cause harm. Most individuals who attempt this remedy do not persist. However, patients newly diagnosed with ganglion cysts may continue to attempt Bible therapy on the advice of trusted family members. Providers should explicitly advise their patients against this remedy. Future research should develop and evaluate educational materials for patients and their family members. Again, all made up. I don't know that family members are telling anyone to hit themselves with books or other heavy objects. But we can see here that there is a real emphasis on what could be done, what the next step would be now that we've had this information. And therefore, it's really establishing what the contribution of this presentation is, and this research, specifically how to advise and discuss with patients this remedy, how to educate patients and their family members. Okay, so that concludes everything that I have prepared. So hopefully we have plenty of time for questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rachel. If you guys have questions, please put it in the chat, and I can read it out to Rachel. Hopefully you enjoyed that abstract example. That was fun to put together.
Yeah, I was laughing while I was editing it.
So we have some questions we received earlier. What would you do if you have inconclusive or not significant results? How would you work that into the abstract, since they typically take a little bit more explaining?
Yes. So, I mean, you do have reserve space for discussing those results in that results section. So you should have room to explain that they are inconclusive, but then you would spend the majority of your time in that section instead of reporting why they're significant. You don't, sorry, you would shift what you're saying to more what you did learn, what you learned that you need to alter your methods, and maybe other researchers can learn from this. Or, this project is in progress and is more of an update so that people know what's happening in the field. And so you just shift what your contribution is. Just remember that it's still a contribution, even if it's not necessarily what is traditionally expected. So.
Great. So kind of on that same vein, I know a lot of students struggle with submitting an abstract when their research isn't done yet. Like it's going to be done by the time the conference happens, but by the time the due date for the abstract is due, they might not have that analysis completely done. So do you have any recommendations for how they can submit that abstract? Like, do they kind of flub their results and say, or are they obvious being like, it's not done yet, but it will be, do you have any suggestions for that?
Yes. So, I mean, you would be honest, right? You wouldn't, you would make up results. You wouldn't do what I did with the ganglion cyst abstract and just make up numbers and recommendations. I mean, you can provide the timeline, right? There's no harm in saying this is how far we are. If you have any sort of preliminary results, even if it's just that, as of writing this abstract, this is what we do have, and this is what we will do that with information. And we anticipate, based on what we already have, that this will happen, to just be straightforward about it. And that's totally acceptable and common enough that I don't think it would shock anyone.
Yeah, I'm sure they're used to that. So again, kind of going with the vein of results, what happens if you collect more data in between and your results change? Do you need to update that abstract? What would you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I would say you would probably notify the conference organizers if they have your abstract on file, and any place where, I mean, if you find your presentation listed, potentially. That's a little bit harder to chase down, but I don't know. What do you think, Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends is sort of how drastically the results change. If it goes from maybe like significant to insignificant, I don't think it would influence whether they, decide to reject your poster or your presentation. But I think it depends on if they're a conference that then publishes the abstract somewhere, you'd probably want to put like the appropriate abstract in that sort of publication, whether it's like a proceedings or whatever.
Right.
So you'd probably just want to let them know because maybe they would want, a newer version of the abstract. Yeah, that'd be my 2 cents. I don't know if, Ian or David has, any other feedback for that, or if anybody in the chat or anybody that's listening has any experience with that and wants to add their thoughts to the chat. Let's see. If an abstract isn't accepted, is it okay to ask for feedback?
I mean, it's always good to get feedback, but I would not anticipate that you would get any from a conference. This is, organizing a conference is above and beyond these organizers' typical duties, right? They're doing this in addition to what they're already doing. So I would say that it would be better to find a colleague for some feedback. I think you'd probably get more likely to get a response. So I would first, if it's rejected, review the guidelines again, see if there was any reason there that it was missed. And then if it's a potential issue with, if you met all those guidelines, then that becomes, okay, well, maybe this wasn't of interest, or maybe they, doubted the study design, or I didn't explain it well enough. And that is a situation where you could then go to a mentor, go to a colleague and say, hey, can you read this abstract and give me feedback on this? And then they know you, they can, presumably they know your field pretty well, and you can work out how to improve it for another attempt at that same conference or a different one.
Great. Do you have any thoughts about if, there's a lab that's going to a conference and they have 3 posters that are going to be next to each other, sort of in the same vein of research? Can they submit one abstract, or are they going to have to submit 3 individual abstracts?
Ooh. I have not encountered that, actually. I believe it's 1-to-1, one abstract to one presentation, but maybe the conference has different guidelines. Have you guys ever encountered that? I haven't seen that.
I haven't personally, but I would say that if that's like of interest to a lab, they have 3 students going with 3 very similar pieces, maybe they could email the organizers and be like, hey, we have 3, can we submit one abstract? Leanne, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, I can add to that. In some of the bigger conferences, there's often a large research project where multiple students are working on it and multiple students want to have the chance to present. So you might see that there are 3 presentations right in a row, all from the same lab. All the posters kind of look the same. You can sort of tell when you're at the conference. But for those people, I would say when they're submitting the abstract, they shouldn't refer to another abstract. Like sometimes people in a paper might say, oh, we use the same methods as, Merrim's 2020. You can't really do that in abstract. You should explain things at least so that somebody can understand it. Because if somebody's searching for information or for abstracts to go to the posters at a conference or presentations at the conference, they might just get the 3rd one that your group sees, and then they don't see any result or they don't see any methods, and they get really confused and they just may not show up at all. So I think each abstract should stand on its own somewhat.
Great. For some reason, I can't open up the Zoom chat. Oh, there we go.
I was going to add something too, if that's okay, really quick.
Yeah, definitely.
So I don't know if this is the same for all fields, but in mine, which is cancer biology, it's also like a good thing to have everyone publish an individual abstract, just because a lot of our bigger conferences have they'll put out like a proceedings report. And so then every individual abstract that gets submitted, that student gets to cite that on their CV as like a first author conference paper. And so that's really good, especially if you're an undergraduate going to a big conference, to get like a paper, even a conference paper to put on your CV for later applications. And so that people can look at it even if they weren't at the conference. But generally for ours, it's all 1-to-1 as well.
Great, thanks, Maggie. Okay, so for writing the objective, should this always be in past tense, like this study aimed to do something versus like we aim?
Yeah, so if you are reporting what you have done, then it should be in past tense. If you are proposing to hold a session that is not reporting, so for example, hosting a panel discussion on a hot topic or something, that would be future tense. So just wherever it happened in the timeline, if you have done it or you will do it, stick with that proper tense.
Another question is, what should we keep in mind for late breaking abstracts?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yeah, what should we keep in mind for late breaking abstracts?
I'm stumped on that one.
Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head either. I know keywords can be super important, so just keep those in mind. Throw them in the abstract. I
I can try to add to that as well. Is I I don't know if it's as much for the writer as for the reader, but if you keep it in mind as the writer to that the things could change. You know, if it's a late breaking abstract and things are still sort of in flux, maybe trying to use some of that language that isn't, you know, this is the way it's going to be, and this conclusion is definitely going to, you know, just be a little more, I'm going to use the word soft, but that's not really a great word to use, in your language, in case your preliminary result in this late breaking situation, once more data are added, it's a little, the conclusion is slightly different.
Good point. All right. How to balance the details to make your abstract stronger when you're limited by the words or character limits?
Yeah, so those tips on conciseness, I know typically in my editing experience, people come to me saying, I've made it as short as I can, and then I go in and see that like we have like little preambles and sentences and you know, using as well as instead of and, stuff like that. So like those earlier tips on how to make it concise can trim a certain amount of words that could help, right? Maybe those aren't the heavy hitters. But in general, one, recognize that you're not going to be able to say everything in the abstract. You're not supposed to be able to. So focus on what is the most significant. And if it helps, you can start with a, you know, what is my summary of my project in 10 sentences and start there. And then as you're like, okay, if this is all I get, but I can add one more sentence, like what would be the next most important thing? And if you just, you know what is the most important information, like there are some things that cannot be left out, right? Like the findings, but maybe it just needs to be the most significant. Like if some things weren't significant, maybe you don't need to say that if it was a secondary measure or outcome. So yeah, I would just prioritizing what needs to be included, recognizing that some things are essential, some things can be kept in but stated a lot shorter, and that we tend to be more wordy than we think we are. And if you take a second look, you probably can trim. And if you can't, then ask, you know, call a friend, phone a friend, go to a colleague, or send it to a friendly neighborhood editor and see what they can cut out, because that's what we do well.
All right. So kind of going along with that, is it important to state like your standard deviation or your mean or your p-values in your abstract, or is that something you could leave out?
I've seen it left out and it's fine, right? So, but if you have room for it, that's great. Maybe including it for the most significant finding. I don't know. What do you think, Jen? I've seen it left out of the abstract.
Yeah. I don't know if I've ever seen it left out, but I don't know, like as a reviewer for abstracts, I don't know if I ever have like placed emphasis on it. Like if I see something without it, I don't feel like that's any less than. As you know, maybe if you're talking about significance, you know, you throw the p-value, but I don't know if I personally care about standard deviation or the mean or anything like that within the abstract itself. But that might also be dependent on the conference. Maybe it would be in the like requirements that they would like. Another thing you could do is like look at if they do post their proceedings or any history from the last conference of what abstracts were there. You could always look at those too and see which ones were accepted and how they formatted them to see if that helps make up your mind if you want to include them.
And I would agree with what you said. If you're calling out something as being statistically significant, then absolutely include that. But if not, and you're just, generally summarizing, maybe that statistical analysis wasn't the primary focus of your study. That would vary. So include it if you can, but and there are some places definitely include it. So if you're calling out the significance of something, then definitely include it. But otherwise, yeah, what Jen said.
So we have time for one more. Would you say the material you covered today for abstracts for conferences is pretty synonymous to abstracts for manuscripts, or do you think they're a little bit different?
They're very similar. So I would say, I think I mentioned this specifically. Some people feel a little braver with conference titles than publication titles. But in terms of process, it's the same. In terms of sections, they're usually the same. So yeah, they're basically.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We will send out, I think, Monday, hopefully the recording, but the slides and the resource guide and the worksheet if you don't have it already. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. If you want to work with me or Rachel looking at your abstracts, I'm available for everybody. Rachel's available for her department, but you can reach out to us and we're here to help you guys. So we really appreciate you joining us and we hope you have a great rest of your day.